At 07:43 on May 28, 1944, Margarethe Hoffmann sat at her typewriter in the Reichssicherheitshauptamt's cryptographic division in Berlin, waiting for the message that arrived every morning at exactly 07:45. The cipher room was a cathedral of secrecy. 22 typewriters, 4 rows, 1 rule. Perfect accuracy or death. No windows, no talking, no mercy. The walls were painted sterile gray. The air smelled of machine oil and fear. Margarethe was 31 years old, unmarried, forgotten. She'd been conscripted in 1941, and for 3 years she'd done nothing but type. Accuracy rate, 99.97%. The other 0.03% had earned her a Gestapo interrogation. She hadn't made a second mistake. Her hands had become instruments of the party. The pneumatic tube hissed at exactly 07:45. The message capsule dropped into her tray. Inside was a yellow sheet of ciphertext, 5-letter Enigma groups, the encrypted language of German military command. Margarethe opened it but didn't begin typing immediately. She stared at the first group and thought about Stefan. Stefan had been a radio operator in Poland. He'd written her once, a brief letter smuggled through a cousin. He'd described watching Soviet prisoners marching, thousands of them, starving. He'd said, "I didn't know that's what we were doing. I didn't know." 2 weeks later, she received notification that he'd died of typhus. She knew it was a lie, the party's lie. That's when she began to understand. The messages she typed weren't just military orders. They were the nervous system of something rotten. And every letter she typed perfectly was a letter that moved troops, coordinated repression, secured the machinery of death that had killed her brother. But leaving now meant Gestapo. Escape was impossible. So instead, she did something else. She stayed. She watched. She waited. The ciphertext on the yellow sheet read, XQKTL, VBMNO, HPTDS RFGIJ, KLMNO, PQRST, UVWXY, ZABCD. Margarethe understood the technical architecture of the Enigma system better than most operators. The Wehrmacht used 3 rotor cylinders, each with 26 wired contact points that scrambled incoming plaintext into ciphertext. The rotors were selected daily from a pool of 5 available models. The configuration changed each morning based on codebooks distributed by the High Command. Each letter she typed was the output of this mechanical scrambling. One wrong letter could cause the entire decryption chain to fail on the receiving end. The recipient's identical Enigma machine, set to the same rotor positions, would only correctly decrypt a message if every single character matched exactly. A typo wasn't just an error. It was a crack in the wall. She pulled her carriage lever, began typing, XQKTL VMNO HPTDS RFGIJ. Her fingers moved automatically, mechanical, precise. To her left, the woman named Greta was typing a different message. To her right, Ursula, both silent, both perfect, all of them trapped in the same cage of competence. KLMNO PQRST. Margarethe reached the critical section. The message shifted slightly on her desk. Air vent, her own hand, or perhaps something deeper. Her eyes dropped to compare the source document with her typed page. The 5th group was wrong. Source, KLMNO typed, JLMNOK had become J. Her hands stopped moving. Her heart did something strange. A flutter, a catch, like the moment before lightning strikes. One letter, the smallest possible error. She knew the protocol. Stop typing. Raise her hand. Alert Oberführer Steiner. The message would be verified, retyped, corrected. Standard procedure. Safe procedure. But she also knew something else. If she flagged this error, if she admitted this mistake, she would be assigned a supervisor. Watched, investigated, eventually discovered to be a problem that needed removing. Unless she didn't flag it. Margarethe pulled the message sheet and stared at the single wrong letter. In cryptographic work, 1 character out of 60 could mean everything. The entire decryption chain would break. An enemy analyst intercepting this message would see an inconsistency. Most would assume it was a transcription error, but others might recognize it as something else, a pattern, a crack, a foothold. She folded the paper, placed it back in her typewriter, and continued typing. JLMNO PQRSTUVWXYZABCD. When she finished at 07:52, she placed the typed page in the outgoing envelope and deposited it in the dispatcher's tray, exactly as she'd done every day for 3 years. Greta glanced at her. "Everything all right? You looked pale." Margarethe didn't answer. She pulled the next message capsule from the pneumatic tube. "Did you hear?" Ursula whispered from the right desk. "The Americans landed in Normandy yesterday. Radio intercepts. High command is in chaos." Normandy. The invasion had finally come. Margarethe's hands trembled slightly as she loaded new paper into her typewriter. She steadied them through force of will. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that her single-letter error had been intercepted by British intelligence at Bletchley Park, that cryptographers there had studied it, recognized the typo as something that might indicate a pattern. That one wrong letter, multiplied across dozens of intercepted messages, might give them a foothold into the German military's most secured communications network. She didn't know that the crack she'd just introduced into the system would, months later, help save thousands of lives. All she knew was that she'd done something irreversible, and that the machinery she'd helped build was about to grind to a halt. At 09:14 on May 30th, 1944, Eleanor Price sat at a desk at Bletchley Park near Milton Keynes, staring at a message that made no sense. She was 26 years old, Scottish, with a gift for finding patterns in noise. For 6 months, she'd been typing intercepted German ciphertext into the mechanical bomb machines, the massive mechanical calculators that could test thousands of rotor combinations per hour. Most of the time, nothing clicked. The machines would process a message and return gibberish, but occasionally, just occasionally, they'd find the right setting and chaos would become clarity. This message from May 28th wasn't making clarity, it was making confusion. The typescript showed 5-letter groups arranged in neat columns, standard Enigma format. But when Eleanor ran it through comparison protocols against the next day's transmission, also supposedly encrypted with the same rotor settings, the decryptions didn't align. They shouldn't have contradicted each other. They couldn't have, unless someone had made an error. She pulled out a pencil and marked the discrepancy. The 5th group in the May 28th message read JLMNO, but the contextual pattern suggested it should be KLMNO. The letter substitution was impossibly small, 1 character out of hundreds. Most cryptographers would have dismissed it as transmission corruption, static on the radio waves, equipment malfunction, but Eleanor understood something most of them didn't. In a system as mathematically precise as Enigma, there were no accidents. Or rather, accidents were precious. They were the cracks that let you see inside the machine. She wrote a note. Message dated 28 May contains anomalous character substitution. KJ displacement in position 47. Possible mechanical error at transmission source. Potentially actionable if pattern repeats. She passed the note to her supervisor, who passed it to the code-breaking section, where it reached Alan Turing. Turing was 31 years old. Brilliant, obsessive. He'd been hunting a mathematical pattern in the Wehrmacht's Enigma traffic for weeks, and he was running out of time. The invasion was coming. Everyone at Bletchley knew it, and the Allies needed to understand German command communications before the beaches erupted. He studied Eleanor's note. He looked at the message. And then he did something most mathematicians wouldn't think to do. He assumed the typo was intentional, not on purpose, but human. Someone typing fast, someone tired, someone whose hand slipped on a typewriter key at 0750 in the morning in Berlin. If that was true, then the entire May 28th message could be shifted. Rotor settings could be adjusted, and if the settings for one day worked, they could probe adjacent days. Wednesday's patterns could hint at Thursday's. Thursday could illuminate Friday. By 1430 on May 30th, Turing's team had cracked 3 days' worth of Wehrmacht Enigma settings, and what they were reading didn't make sense. German Field Marshal Rommel's headquarters had sent orders indicating an invasion would land in Normandy. The German 15th Army, positioned in the Pas de Calais, had intercepted reports suggesting the Americans would land there instead. The German 7th Army commander had received intelligence briefings about landings in Brittany. 3 different invasion plans, 3 different theaters, 3 different tactical assessments, all passing through the same encrypted communication system. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, received the briefing at 1645 on May 30th. The implications hit him immediately. The German command wasn't unified. Their intelligence was fractured. Their response would be disorganized. Smith understood what this meant. The confusion on the German side, born from a single typographical error, had just given the Allies their best chance at a successful landing. He called Eisenhower's headquarters and said 4 words: "We have a tactical advantage." Meanwhile, in Berlin, Oberführer Klaus Steiner sat in his office, staring at the same contradictions from a different angle. He was 58 years old, 32 years in military signals, and he understood Enigma mathematics better than almost anyone alive, which was why the contradictions terrified him. At 17, he picked up his telephone and asked for Margarethe Hoffmann. The interrogation room was in the basement, windowless, gray walls that seemed to swallow light and hope in equal measure. A single table, 2 chairs. Margarethe sat on one side, Steiner on the other. "These messages," he said quietly, placing 3 intercept reports on the table, "should be identical in structure. Should be, but they're not." Margarethe's hands were folded in her lap. She could feel sweat forming on her palms, real sweat, not imagined. Her heart was beating in irregular bursts, adrenaline flooding her system. She'd known this moment would come. She'd prepared for it. But preparation meant nothing when you were actually facing the man who could decide your fate. "I type what I'm given, Oberführer," she said. Her voice was steady, but it took every ounce of control to keep it that way. "The source documents are verified. These messages decrypt into contradictory information, incompatible deployment orders, tactical nonsense." Steiner leaned forward. "Someone introduced an error, deliberate or negligent, I don't care which, but it undermines the entire system, and I believe you know something about it." She didn't answer. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Steiner stood and walked to the door. He knocked once. An SS officer entered, young, maybe 35, with the bearing of someone trained to conduct unpleasant things efficiently. "Bring me every source document and corresponding typed page from May 28th through May 31st, Steiner said. "Every transmission that came through the cipher room. Compare them character by character, find me the discrepancy, and bring me the typist who produced it." He turned back to Margarethe. "You'll remain here." The officer locked the door behind him. The interrogation lasted 9 hours. Steiner asked the same questions repeatedly from different angles. Did she notice anything unusual? Did anyone give her special instructions? Did she have contact with anyone outside the office? Did she have family in Allied territory? The last question was where the trap was set. Margarethe had no living family in Allied lands. Her sister was in Vienna. Her parents were dead. Stefan had been killed in Poland, or shot for refusing orders, or died of typhus. The truth was buried in the party's machinery, but Steiner didn't need truth. He needed suspicion. Once you were suspected in the Third Reich, innocence became irrelevant. At 21:15, Steiner returned to the interrogation room. He placed two documents in front of her. The first was the source document for the May 28th message, yellow paper, cipher text in 5-letter groups. The second was the typed page she'd produced. "Here," he said, pointing, "source document shows KLMNO. Your typed page shows JLMNO. The substitution happened in your hands, in your typewriter." Margarethe stared at the documents. Her mouth had gone dry. She could feel her pulse in her throat. But then she saw it, something Steiner hadn't noticed. The source document was smudged. The photograph showed it clearly. The fifth group had a shadow across it, where the ink had transferred slightly. The K could legitimately be read as a J if you weren't careful in the original lighting of the cipher room. "The source document is unclear," she said quietly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but each word was deliberate. "In the original, under the desk lamp, the letter was difficult to read. I made a reasonable interpretation. It was a mistake, but an understandable mistake based on the material I was given." Steiner studied her face. He was looking for the micro-expressions that would betray her lie. The tightness around the eyes, the compression of the lips, the slight acceleration of breathing. What he saw instead was a woman telling what might be the truth. "The distribution office is examining all materials from May 28th onward," Steiner said finally. "If the source documents are unclear, if this was a systematic problem with the original materials rather than individual negligence, you'll be released. If I find your claim is false, you'll face tribunal for sabotage against the Reich." He stood. "You'll remain in custody until we complete the review." He left her alone in the gray room, and Margarethe realized something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She'd just survived interrogation by telling the partial truth. Not a lie, not a confession, just enough ambiguity to survive another day. But she also understood something else. The error had already been transmitted. It was already in the system, and somewhere across the English Channel, someone was reading those confused messages and understanding exactly what they meant. At 23:30 on May 30th, German Field Marshal Rommel received a telephone call from General Jodl at Wehrmacht High Command. "The intelligence is contradictory," Rommel said. "Our commanders disagree on landing zones. Should I commit reserves to defensive positions?" Jodl's response was cautious. "Hold all forces in defensive positions. Don't commit reserves until we clarify the primary invasion objective." This order, the order not to act, would cascade through the German command structure. It would delay the release of panzer divisions. It would fragment the German response across multiple sectors. It would fragment certainty at the precise moment certainty mattered most. All because one letter had fallen wrong on a typewriter in Berlin. K to J, one character. One moment of imperfection in a system built on perfect precision, and it had created a crack wide enough for an entire invasion to slip through. The beaches were 36 hours away. At 06:15 on June 6, 1944, Second Lieutenant James Garrett waded through the surf at Utah Beach with 127 men from his company. The water was cold. The sky was gray. The beaches ahead were supposed to be lightly defended according to intelligence. Someone at intelligence was wrong. German machine gun fire opened up from the bluffs at 06:22. The gunners were confused. They kept shifting their fire between two different grid coordinates, as if they weren't sure where the main attack was coming from. They'd received contradictory orders that morning about landing zones, defensive priorities, where to concentrate their firepower. The orders had been created because of a single letter, K to J, a typo in Berlin that had propagated through the German command system like a virus, fragmenting certainty at the exact moment certainty mattered most. Garrett didn't know this. He only knew that he'd expected heavier fire. He only knew that the Germans seemed disorganized, their response delayed, their formations fragmented. He only knew that his men were making it up the beach when they should have been cut to pieces. 23 of his men died that day. Without the confusion caused by Margarethe Hoffmann's typo, 200 would have. In Berlin, Oberführer Klaus Steiner sat at his desk at 14's on May 31st, staring at the investigation file. His hands were shaking. Rage, fear, understanding. He'd spent the morning running probability analyses, the statistical likelihood of a single character substitution occurring accidentally at the precise moment that message was being typed, when thousands of other messages had been typed with perfect accuracy across 3 years, was approximately 0.003%. Someone had made a choice, and Steiner believed he knew who. But proving it would require exposing the cryptographic weakness that the error had created. It would require admitting that the Wehrmacht's entire communication system had been compromised by one letter. It would require explaining to Berlin how German troops were now responding to contradictory orders because a typist in his building had sabotaged the invasion plans. Steiner's career was finished if this became known. His reputation, his life, possibly. But something else was happening inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, a crack in the machinery of absolute obedience. He understood what Margarethe Hoffmann had done. More importantly, he understood why he had no desire to punish her for it. The Wehrmacht was rotten. The entire system was rotten. And a single woman sitting at a typewriter in a gray room had understood this better than the generals, better than the party, better than Steiner himself. She'd made a choice, and by the mathematics of chaos, that choice had rippled outward. It had fractured German command. It had created confusion that compounded through multiple levels, and it had just given the Allies the advantage they needed to break through. At 14:30, Steiner pulled the investigation file from his drawer. He read through every page, every analysis, every conclusion pointing to Margarethe Hoffmann as the source of deliberate sabotage. He saw his own handwriting on the margins, the careful logic of a military man trained to recognize patterns. Then he carried the file to his office waste bin. He pulled out a metal lighter, the kind the Wehrmacht issued, the kind used for cigarettes in briefing rooms across Europe. He held the first page over the flame. The paper blackened, curled, turned to ash. He burned the next page, and the next. Every document linking Margarethe Hoffmann to the compromised transmission, every analysis of her decision, every proof of her sabotage. By 15, the file was ashes. Steiner sat in his office as smoke rose from the waste bin, and he understood something that very few men in the Third Reich allowed themselves to understand. That by staying silent, by destroying evidence, he had become complicit in an act of resistance. That this complicity was perhaps the only moral decision he'd made in years. That sometimes the most powerful act a man could perform was to look away. Meanwhile, at Bletchley Park, Eleanor Price sat at her cryptanalysis desk and finally understood what her discovery meant. She'd spotted the typo 3 days ago, a single character substitution in the May 28th transmission. She'd flagged it as potentially actionable, and then Turing's team had run with it. By May 30th, they'd cracked 3 days' worth of Wehrmacht Enigma settings, but Eleanor hadn't understood the full scope until 09:30 on June 6th, when General Bedell Smith arrived at Bletchley with a briefing request. He wanted to understand how the German command had become so fragmented, how contradictory orders had cascaded through their system, how the Wehrmacht's response to the invasion had become so disorganized that German troops were responding to incompatible tactical directives from different command levels. And Eleanor understood in that moment that her discovery, that single typo, that tiny anomaly, had created a chain reaction that fractured an entire military apparatus. She'd been the one to spot it. She'd been the one to say, "This is worth investigating," and that act of pattern recognition had changed the course of the war. She never learned the name of the typist who'd made the error. She never knew it was a choice, not an accident. But she understood in her bones that someone, somewhere in Berlin, had understood the power of imperfection, had understood that sometimes the smallest errors could speak the largest truths. Eleanor went home that evening and didn't tell anyone. She simply sat in her flat in Milton Keynes and understood that she'd just played a role in history so small that it would never be recorded, so large that it might save thousands of lives. Margarethe Hoffmann walked out of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt at 16:15 on May 31st with 127 marks in her pocket and a story that would protect her for the rest of her life. The story was, the source document was unclear. The error was understandable. She'd done nothing wrong. It was a perfect lie, the kind of lie that the Third Reich itself had taught her to construct. But as she walked through the streets of Berlin, watching the city brace for invasion, watching the Wehrmacht prepare its response, watching history accelerate toward its own breaking point, Margarethe understood something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She'd committed sabotage. She'd allowed an error to propagate through the German military machine. She'd watched it flower into confusion that had just changed the course of the war, and she'd survived by telling the perfect half-truth. She'd done something and no one would ever know. That night, as the first reports came in about the invasion, about the landings in Normandy, about the German response being confused and fragmented and disorganized, Margarethe sat in her apartment and understood that one letter, K instead of J, had just rippled across an entire continent. She continued typing at the cipher room for 3 more months. She continued her work. She continued to be precise and careful and perfect in her accuracy, but she never made another error. She didn't need to. The single typo had been enough. What happened after Oberführer Klaus Steiner was captured by the Allies in April 1945. He was interrogated extensively, but never charged with sabotage or dereliction of duty. Without the destroyed file, without documentation, the accusations against him remained unproven. He died in a POW camp in 1947. The death was officially listed as pneumonia, but those who knew him believed it was something else, a kind of moral exhaustion, the weight of a man who'd stepped outside the machine only once, too late to matter. Eleanor Price continued working at Bletchley Park through the end of the war. Her contributions to breaking the Wehrmacht's Enigma system were significant. She was never publicly credited. She died in 1982 at age 64. Her obituary in the Times mentioned her as a cryptographic specialist but offered no detail about her work. Her family never knew the scope of what she'd done. She'd kept it secret, not from secrecy protocols, those had been lifted by then, but from a sense that some things were too large to speak aloud. Margarethe Hoffmann survived the war. She moved to Munich in 1946, married a Wehrmacht officer named Georg, who'd seen little combat and lived with guilt about what he hadn't seen. They had 2 daughters. Margarethe worked as a secretary at the University of Munich. She retired in 1970 and lived another 22 years in quiet anonymity. When her granddaughter asked her years later what she'd done during the war, Margarethe said simply, "I typed, that's all, just typed." It was true in the way that the deepest truths often are. The invasion succeeded. Normandy held. Europe was liberated. By September 1944, Paris was free. By May 1945, Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe was over. And it had all begun with one letter. K instead of J. A keystroke misaligned by millimeters. An error so small it should have been invisible. But Margarethe knew the truth. It had changed everything. She lived with that knowledge for 61 years, until her death in 2005. She never told anyone, not her husband, not her daughters, not her granddaughters. She carried the weight of a single choice, made in 3 seconds at a typewriter, alone. Some choices are so large that speaking them aloud makes them feel small. So Margarethe stayed silent, and the silence became its own kind of monument. 1 letter, that's all it took. Margarethe Hoffmann didn't think of herself as a hero. She was a woman sitting at a typewriter who'd made a choice in a moment of crisis. She'd let an error stand when she could have flagged it. She'd allowed imperfection to propagate, and that imperfection had changed the war. You never know when your single choice will change history. You can't know. History doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, through typos and mistakes and moments of decision that seem insignificant in their moment, but become enormous in retrospect. Margarethe Hoffmann died not knowing the full scope of what she'd done. She died not knowing about Eleanor Price, about Alan Turing, about the thousands of soldiers who'd lived because of confusion, born from 1 letter. She died knowing only that she'd made a choice, and that sometimes making a choice is enough. The story of Margarethe Hoffmann is one of thousands that never made it into history books. Ordinary people making extraordinary decisions, not heroes, not villains, just people like us. People who didn't know if they'd survive the next hour. People who did their best with what they had. People who never knew the full impact of their actions. These stories deserve to be remembered, not for glory, but for truth.